and I'll say a few words and we'll get started.
All right.
Okay. So welcome everybody to tonight's forum. I just wanted to remind us of the upcoming forum, which is going to be on Tuesday, November 10th at 7 p.m. And Enrique Jang from the Poe House in Baltimore is going to give us a virtual tour. And I have her description in the chat box there for your reference. But tonight, we have Dr. Carole Shaffer-Koros, who's going to talk to us about the mysterious death of Edgar Allan Poe.
I call it mysterious because I have a lot of information, but it's very hard to nail down facts. So today, October 7th, is the 171st anniversary of the death of Edgar Allan Poe. And my daughter Sylvia gave me this paper mache raven to honor his memory. I call it Evermore, Evermore. This is a discussion of the much debated cause of his death, which continues even to the present day. It may seem like a more morbid subject, but my interest stems from my personal and nursing school experience with many illnesses, including delirium tremens, a side effect of withdrawal from excessive consumption of alcohol, and a stint in the tuberculosis ward of the now defunct Philadelphia General Hospital. Tuberculosis is caused by an airborne Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which causes symptoms of fever, night sweats, and weight loss. In its pulmonary form, it can also erode the lungs to the point of hemorrhage. In the 1950s, treatment consisted of two drugs, streptomycin and isoniazid, but treatment has to be started early on the disease, or it can attack other organs in the body besides the lungs. A lot of people don't realize that. The pulmonary form of the disease can be diagnosed by a sputum culture or any form by the Tyne or Mantoux test. In the 19th century, however, the situation was very different. Diagnosis was based primarily on the basis of subjective observation. I have a hunch that tuberculosis played a major role in Poe's death. What we do know about his final days is largely based on the testimonies of three physicians, Dr. John F. Carter of Richmond, Dr. John J. Moran, and Dr. Joseph Evans Snodgrass, and both of them are from Baltimore. I searched extensively for a death certificate for Edgar Allan Poe, but never found one, and thanks to Geoffrey Savoy, who told me that in the mid-1800s, death certificates were uncommon, so I stopped looking. It seems that a generalized medical record was sent to Baltimore City Health Commissioner, Dr. John Hayter, and this morbidity information was reported to the newspapers as aggregate numbers. Around October 7th, 1849, there was one case of a male between age 30 and 40 whose death resulted from, quote, congestion of the brain, and people have identified him as Poe. The 19th century medical term would have been phrenitis, an ancient, rather vague term, and the Greek word is the root of frenetic and frenzy, meaning a lot of activity. In more modern times, symptoms described by Dr. Moran would be called encephalitis, a term that he later used in one of his publications. Dr. John Moran's vague initial diagnosis opened the gates for a flood of theories about the cause of Poe's death. The conflicting stories from the medical men involved of Poe's case remind me of the Japanese film Rashomon, where every witness offers a different view of a murder. An amusing 2009 blog by Undine, whoever she is, entitled The World of Edgar Allan Poe, has a long entry. It's called, How Did Edgar Allan Poe Die? And she answers her own question. I haven't the slightest idea, and neither do you. That's what she says. She lists all the theories: delirium tremens, rabies, brain tumor, syphilis, meningitis, tuberculosis, alcohol poisoning, suicide, and the what she calls unbelievable cooping explanation. Undine attacks Dr. Moran, calling him Dr. Moron, and with good reason. In 1851, Moran redirected his attention from medicine to a literary career. Riding on the coattails of Poe's fame, he went on the lecture circuit and published articles about Poe's final days, embroidering the tale as he retold it. He became a kind of Poe-esque unreliable narrator, reversing medical observation and creating purulent dramatic detail that ensured audiences for the rest of his career. Most importantly, he countered the malicious accusations of Rufus Griswold's obituary. On the other hand, Dr. Snodgrass, the temperance man, wrote and spoke publicly about Poe as a prime example of alcohol abuse. Drink and you die. Even Dr. Carter jumped on the bandwagon, publishing an article about Poe's final visit to Richmond. According to most sources, before leaving Richmond, Poe had visited Elmira Shelton, who, in a later letter to Maria Muddy Clem, stated that Poe was not well and apparently had a fever. That evening in Richmond, for some unknown reason, Poe visited Dr. John F. Carter, whose later testimony fails to mention any fever. Poe managed to mistakenly carry off Dr. Carter's cane, and he still had it when he was hospitalized. Poe arrived by steamer in Baltimore on September 29th. His activities on the next few days are not exactly known, but there's some testimony that in spite of having joined the Temperance Union, Poe indulged in heavy drinking with some friends. On October 3rd, 1849, Poe was found by a Baltimore pressman, Joseph Walker, in front of a tavern used as a polling place. Poe was dressed in disheveled clothing and in bad physical shape, which led to the theory of cooping, the practice of disguising men so that they could vote again. The reward was a drink of alcohol, probably not of very good quality. But apparently he told Mr. Walker to contact his presumed friend, Baltimore physician and publisher, Dr. Joseph Evans Snodgrass. Dr. Snodgrass believed that Poe was very drunk and did not immediately suggest going to the hospital. Fortunately, Poe's relative, Harry Herring, recommended that they seek medical attention. Poe was transported by carriage to Washington College Hospital, where he came under the care of Dr. John J. Moran, a young and rather inexperienced doctor. He had only graduated from medical school 2 years prior. The hospital has a very complicated history, and by the time of Poe's admission, it had already changed its name to Baltimore City Marine Hospital. The facts of that hospitalization are very fuzzy, to say the least. On November 15th, after Poe's death, Dr. Moran wrote to Muddy Clem that Eddie was, quote, unconscious of his condition and that he suffered tremors and hallucinations, typical symptoms of delirium tremens. On the other hand, these could also be symptoms of a very high fever. The standard treatment for delirium tremens would have been a sedative, most likely laudanum. Laudanum is an addictive derivative of opium widely used in the 19th century that can cause hallucinations like those described by some of Poe's characters, say the narrator of Ligeia. An overdose would affect the central nervous system to the point of suppressing breathing and eventually causing death. It was a known substance used to commit suicide, as Edith Wharton shows in the case of Lily Bart in The House of Mirth. And remember, Poe's attempted suicide in Boston in the fall of 1848 with an ounce of laudanum following his failed romance with Sarah Helen Whitman. Dr. Moran doesn't indicate whether or not he gave Poe laudanum, but in a later description states that administered an, quote, anodyne, which could be anything given to relieve painful symptoms. In a publication at about 1875, Moran has completely revised his description of Poe after his hospital admission, even changing the date of that admission. Poe is not unconscious or suffering from delirium or tremors, as he had told Maria Clem. These lines are written like a dialogue of a melodrama, as Poe not only is awake, but he allegedly declaims lines like, quote, "Death's dark angel has done her work. I am so rudely clashed upon the shore, upon the storm without compass or helm. Language cannot tell the gulfing wave that swells, sways, and sweeps tempest-like over me." I love the alliteration. In 1885, Moran issues a publication entitled A Defense of Edgar Allan Poe, countering Griswold's and Snodgrass's accusations of alcoholic debauchery and claiming, quote, "I hereby affirm that Edgar Allan Poe did not die under the influence of any kind of intoxicating drink." It's hard to know which version of Dr. Moran's testimony is to be believed. Looking back over Edgar's health history, there is reason to believe that his repeated exposure to tuberculosis resulted in his developing some form of the disease. Starting at age 3, he was present at his mother Elizabeth's side when she died on December 8, 1811. The description of her gradual wasting away and growing weak points to her death as a result of consumption or tuberculosis, as we now call it. Later, during their time in England, John Allen did not communicate much about Edgar or his health, but when Edgar was 9.5, Allen noted that he was, quote, "thin as a razor." At the same time, Fanny Allen, and this is kind of a throw-in, was suffering some chronic illness that Allen seemed to ignore. Fanny died on February 28, 1829, at the age of 44 or so, of an illness the local paper called, quote, "lingering and painful," unquote. Frankly, one wonders, what was that illness? Was it cancer? Was it perhaps tuberculosis? Furthermore, Edgar was very close to his older brother, William Henry Leonard Poe. They lived together in the same Clem household in Baltimore, perhaps even sharing a bed. Henry was known to be a heavy drinker, and he died on August 1, 1831, of tuberculosis at the age of 24. Later, Poe was obviously in intimate contact with his wife in close quarters in their Bronx cottage. It was reported in the Morning Express on December 15, 1846, that, quote, "We regret to learn that this gentleman and his wife are both dangerously ill with the consumption," and, quote, "they are so far reduced as to be barely able to obtain the necessities of life," unquote. And financial assistance was requested. Virginia died at home on January 30th, 1847, in the 24th year of her age, meaning she was 24. According to the New York Daily Tribune. Her illness must have been horrible, as Poe described in detail prolonged suffering and a series of pulmonary hemorrhages that Virginia suffered in his letter on January 4th, 1848, to George Everleth. So over his lifetime, Poe was in intimate contact with at least 3 persons whose death was attributed to tuberculosis. There were periodic reports of Poe being ill over the years. His poverty, poor housing, and perhaps poor nutrition could have contributed to chronic illness such as tuberculosis. He could very well have a latent TB, and as a current pulmonologist, Dr. Mark Zimmerman informed me, consumption of alcohol can cause a reactivation of the tuberculosis bacillus that could result in death. As the blogger Undine suggests, the search for the cause of Edgar Allan Poe's death goes on, but it peaked in 1996. At the ALA in Baltimore that year, Dr. Michael Benitez proposed that Poe had died of rabies or hydrophobia, that is, a fear of water. However, there's no mention of any animal bite discovered on Poe's body, And apparently Dr. Moran gave the dehydrated Poe water and other liquids that he was able to swallow. At the PSA conference in Richmond, Albert Dunay, an environmental engineer, suggested that Poe had died of carbon monoxide, a byproduct of coal-based gaslighting, a theory undermined by his offer to sell carbon monoxide detectors. Still seeking a primary cause of Poe's death, around 2003, Mr. Dunay designed a study to analyze the heavy metal content of Edgar and Virginia Poe's hair. While all the levels were much higher than today's normal levels, none was high enough to result in death. Mr. Dunay and our own Renee Van Sloten recently studied the deleterious effect of carbon monoxide on the body's ability to combat COVID-19. They observe a close correlation between a high level of air pollution, including carbon monoxide, and fatalities from the virus. The problem of connecting this to Poe is that carbon monoxide poisoning is tested through blood samples. But since Poe was exposed chronically to the pollutants of burning coal gas for lighting and other pollutants in the air at the time in the 19th century, it's very plausible that his pulmonary system would have been weakened by heavy metals and carbon monoxide. The final blow, the pathogen, would have been a reactivation of the tuberculosis bacillus. The best way to verify that Poe had TB would be exhume his corpse. The bacillus is known to have found in thousand-year-old mummies, but considering the size and weight of Poe's tomb, that's probably not going to happen. I don't think a single diagnosis can explain Poe's death. As with COVID-19, underlying conditions contribute to the body's reaction to illness. To me, it seems that latent tuberculosis, a system weakened by pollutants and aggravated by the consumption of alcohol, could have proved deadly for Edgar Allan Poe. Please feel free to disagree. That's it.
All right, thank you so much, Carol. And so she has invited us now to disagree. So
I think Renee will have something to say.
So I'm sure people have some comments on this, but thank you so much for that presentation. And yeah, let's get this discussion going. So if you'd like to, you can, if you want to do the raise hand function, that's fine. I'll pay attention to that, or you can just open up your microphone.
I've done this.
No, I'll go ahead and okay.
Where's my mouse?
All right.
I'm looking for my mouse.
Oh, okay, you're just trying to, yeah, stop your presentation. I can actually just probably
I don't know what to do here.
I'm going to actually just take the screen back in a moment. If
I will note that it's not only the size of the monument that's a problem, but it is, although it's marble, it's really quite fragile. I don't think there's any chance anyone would ever want to lift it. And there's probably no tissue left. I mean, it's, you know, unless you can detect something from the bones, I don't know.
Yeah, it would be in the
justify.
bones. Yeah, in the mummies, that's where they found the tuberculosis bacillus, in the bones.
Okay, well, that those should still exist.
Yeah, but we know we're not going to get to them.
You're probably not going to get to them, yeah. But at least that is a theory that could be tested at some point.
Yeah, I think Renee had something to say. Is Renee here?
Yeah, well, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, you mentioned my name. Well, the fact is, the past year, the Netherlands National Health Council produced a report about carbon monoxide. I have it here. And it was going to be the subject of my paper in Boston, because I think that there have been new facts known about carbon monoxide that throw a new light on Poe's death as well. In the summer of 1849, he was in Richmond, and you showed us a picture of his 3 weeks before his death, before he died. And it is clear on that picture he has no telltale phase, this asymmetrical phase that is characteristic for carbon monoxide poisoning. And Richmond didn't have gasworks at the time. That was only 6 or 7 years later. And the fact is that he became ill again as soon as he entered the steamer to Baltimore. Baltimore was a gaslit city, and the hospital was probably gaslit. So he was again exposed to a lot of carbon monoxide.
Right.
And I think that contributed considerably to his death. The symptoms that he had, hallucinations, fever, they're all similar to the symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning.
Well, they're rather general.
They are rather general, yes, that's true.
Because I know people that had fevers that had hallucinations and all those symptoms that, you know, could be also delirium tremens. I don't know. You know, they're very general.
That's true. But so are the symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning.
Right.
And the fact is, he was exposed to carbon monoxide as soon as he entered that steamer to Baltimore, and in Baltimore itself, and in the hospital.
Yeah,
So
well, I'd also like to point out that he came by steamer, and he perhaps had been on the train earlier, and trains, and when I was very young, were still burning coal and wood, and there was a lot of ash in the air. And if you wore a white blouse, you came home with a black blouse.
Yes,
so
true.
people were inhaling these pollutants, you know, constantly when they were doing traveling, constantly.
Yeah, they do, but I mean, chronic carbon monoxide poisoning was very common in the 19th century. And even in the 20th century, when people were using coal to heat their homes.
Oh, but they're dying of it now when they're having generators in their enclosed spaces.
Sure, absolutely, absolutely. But there is a big difference between acute carbon monoxide poisoning and chronic carbon monoxide poisoning.
Oh yeah, acute, you die immediately.
Completely different symptoms. And Poe had the typical of the symptoms of chronic carbon monoxide poisoning. Yeah, not only before he died, but also in earlier periods in his life.
Yeah, well, the theory about carbon monoxide poisoning being the only determinant is problematic because it has to be tested with blood sample, and we cannot do that with Poe.
No, impossible now. Yeah,
it's on the observational factors. The estimation of the symptoms that he's exhibiting. And you know, Moran, you heard what I said about Moran. I mean, what he says one thing, then he says something else, and it, you know, hardly reliable as a medical doctor. But we see that occurring in Washington, D.C. now.
Great. Alex, did you want to say something, or?
I just wanted to have Carole address. Clearly, Poe dies at 40, and what I'd like her to address is the problems with alcohol that are not exactly the minor in his life. In the year or so leading up to him finding him in the streets of Baltimore, what are some of the evidence of him really having trouble with alcohol and with delirium tremens?
Well, it would have been jaundice. If you drink enough, it affects your liver to the point where you can develop actual varices in your esophagus, and if they rupture, you could bleed to death. I've seen that happen to people. I'm not really ready to say that Poe was a chronic alcoholic. I really believe, and again, this is from personal experience, that some people, I think Hal Poe may have mentioned this, can drink an ounce of alcohol and they act very drunk. They have an intolerance to alcohol consumption. And so he doesn't appear jaundiced in that photograph, right? That was taken 3 weeks before his demise, more or less.
I guess I would say that there are a lot of witnesses of Poe drunk and in trouble in various cities in the last couple of years. and he would write about it in his letters, often saying it was Virginia that led him to that to start up drinking. I guess my question generally is is there evidence in effect for saying the effort to push back against the fact that this is somebody who sort of drank himself to death, even if he didn't do it all the time, he certainly did it often. Is there evidence to say that it really wasn't the problems with alcohol that ultimately led to his demise?
If I can actually offer the observation that we have the same problem essentially with Poe's drinking that we have with his death, in that lots of witnesses say absolutely contradictory things. There are people who say that they saw Poe drinking in Richmond, and there are people who say when they saw Poe in Richmond, he hadn't been drinking. And sometimes they turn out to be the same people. So we really don't have good, reliable information about how much drinking Poe might have done. There are lots of assumptions that what I guess I would call a psychotic episode in Philadelphia on his way down to Richmond was caused by drinking. Theoretically, his comment that he had been arrested and sent to Moy Menzing for drinking, but it's not really clear that he may have been something that looked like he was intoxicated. Again, there was a case not that long ago where someone was having a heart attack outside of a pharmacy, and people reported him, and he was arrested for being intoxicated, but he wasn't drunk at all. He was having a heart attack.
Wow.
So it was an easy misinterpretation of other symptoms. My grandmother was diabetic. When she would have insulin or sugar reactions,
Right.
it looked like intoxication.
Yes.
So lots of things can present as intoxication to people who don't really know any better. So we really don't know how much Poe had been drinking towards the last couple of years of his life to allow for delirium tremens. We know by his own admission that he had been drinking pretty heavily when Virginia was sick, but she died in 47. We don't know how much drinking he was doing after that. I mean, again, Poe, I think it's fair to characterize Poe as a binge drinker rather than a chronic drunk. So I don't think he ever really had enough to drink that you could say that he probably had cirrhosis of the liver or any of those kinds of symptoms.
No.
It's likely that whatever drinking he did might have been exacerbated by the fact that his eating habits probably were not particularly ideal, since he didn't have a lot of money and probably ate, mostly bread, cheese, whatever he could sort of get hands on.
Okay, I think John wanted to, oh, sorry.
No,
Alex, we can go.
continue. I was simply noting, if you look at the Poe log and you look at the index under alcohol and alcoholism and so forth, there are hundreds of examples of evidence of over the years. I guess my question tends to come back to is the effort to find other explanations for him dying at 40 in the streets of Baltimore, an effort to excuse the problems with alcohol? That's the general question.
To some extent, I think that is probably true, but it is also true that many of the accounts of drinking are of the same incident, so it's not necessarily one incident reported 5 times is not 5 incidents. A lot of those people are not necessarily very reliable. They are not necessarily contemporary accounts. There are obvious examples that Poe did certainly drink. He did drink to excess on occasion, but the evidence just is not there to say that Poe was a chronic drunk. That just does not exist.
I disagree. If you read everything, read all the accounts of.
And I have.
I'm sure you have, but Poe himself admitted to an episode of delirium tremens in Philadelphia, and to predicate that as a cause of death is to assume that he had by then sustained chemical dependence on alcohol. I don't believe he was a chronic alcoholic all his life, but I believe after Virginia died, the drinking increased, and I believe during the last year of his life, he had a chemical dependence on alcohol, and which would have caused alcohol withdrawal when he was deprived of it. And I believe that that had a lot to do with his death.
And it's not impossible, but the evidence is not there.
Well,
But remember that Hal Poe did say that the Poes have an intolerance to alcohol, and it doesn't take much to get you drunk. I know my own family's like that. An ounce will do you in, I can tell you. So people think you're drunk, and you only had, and that does not give you cirrhosis because it's not much alcohol.
But I think Alex's point is valid, that one of the reasons there's a lot of searching is to try to come up with an explanation that does not put Poe sort of at the center of the blame.
Let's let John get in here, please. Thanks, everybody.
All I was going to say is that Poe, after he had one of these episodes with alcohol, seemed to be incapacitated for a while, and was apologetic, and that's when he wrote the letters. So to me, it seems like, as Carole is saying, he's kind of like Cassio, that just a little bit of alcohol seriously affected him. And I just don't see him being able to be as productive as he was. You know, he could not have been drinking all the time. Now maybe Alexander's right that in the last year of his life that changed. But it seems to me that he couldn't have been as productive as he was if he was a chronic drunk, just because the effects of alcohol on him seem to be so severe.
It's an interesting question if it is in fact true that he had sort of an enhanced effect of alcohol, if that would mean also some of the medical effects. Maybe it doesn't take as much to get more serious effects if small amount of alcohol make you seem so intoxicated. And maybe you're just that much more sensitive to it. Maybe you could get cirrhosis or delirium tremens without having quite as much alcohol in the long term.
Renata wants to say something. Please, Renata.
Hi, good evening, everybody.
Hi.
I was just thinking, there is this letter that I wrote, that I read so many years ago, from Sarah Whitman, talking about Poe and alcohol. And this letter has always been on the back of my mind every time somebody asks me whether Poe was a drunkard, etc., because this is a big myth that seems to be a favorite here in Brazil. Every time we're talking about Poe's works, people always ask us about his private life and the myths around his life and death and alcohol. And I remember this letter, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it. And Sarah Whitman would be one of those witnesses to Poe's relationship with alcohol. And I remember that she would say, I can't quote exactly her words here because I don't have the letter here right offhand, but I remember her saying something about the fact that he would be affected by alcohol very soon, that he had some kind of an allergy or intolerance to alcohol. So those were Sarah Whitman's words. And she was a big sweetheart and a very good friend of his. So I wonder how true her words would actually be. And it's true that there are people who drink a lot and simply don't get drunk at all. My grandparents, Russian, all of them, from my father's side, they would drink a whole bottle of vodka all at once and still be able to drive, still be able to talk, still be able to dance.
That's true.
While other people like me, with just a little bit of champagne, that's enough. So I think we're talking about something that is really hard to measure.
Has to do with your metabolism.
Although it definitely does seem that Poe did not respond well to alcohol,
No.
and rather quickly. So small amounts did seem to do him in pretty quickly, and he'd be very sick for a period of time after that.
Right.
This same issue comes up in discussions about Faulkner's writing. Faulkner was a binge drinker, and I know that from what I read about his Hollywood years, his drinking was especially bad in the early 30s, in part because he hated writing those B-movie scripts in Hollywood, and he had a terrible contract with Jack Warner whereby whatever he wrote was the property of Warner Brothers Studios. And so his creativity ebbed a little bit. And in those moments when he wasn't able to write, when he didn't feel free to, I guess, exercise his creative faculties, he drank heavily. I'm wondering if Poe had this similar experience, that in these moments either of personal distress, that's certainly what he says in the Eveleth letter, right? Is that people have mistaken the drinking for causing the despair, whereas the drink was the response to depression and despair over the loss of Virginia. And certainly those remarks appear at the end of his life. I was thinking also about what Jeffrey said about contemporary testimony. There are a number of people alive in the 1840s, people who observed Poe, who actually said that he could not hold his liquor. I mean, that testimony surfaces more than once. So the notion that he had a low tolerance, there is contemporary evidence of that, not only from anything Poe might have said himself, but from people who observed him.
The notion that he had intolerance to alcohol or an unusual sensitivity to alcohol may be true, but also to believe that he stopped at one glass is absurd. It actually is. I mean, he may have had an adverse reaction to one glass, but that doesn't mean he stopped at one glass.
It would make him sick.
Well, but it probably wouldn't have made him sick while he was drinking, that night. I mean, it is a little tricky. One of the problems with a lot of the recollections, if you go back and read through a lot of the reminiscences and articles and people being cited in biographies,
I have.
There is a clear effect of people reading each other. So you begin to wonder after a while, is this original information or have they been influenced and read it someplace? The record is so tainted, it's basically impossible to write a truly reliable Poe biography or make absolute statements about controversial topics like drinking.
Jeffrey, do you recall that passage in one of the reminiscences of Charles Frederick Briggs's daughter? And she actually defends Poe, and she says, I never saw Poe intoxicated in my life, and I didn't encounter
yeah, but you get Lambert A. Wilmer saying that all the time he knew Poe, he really hadn't been drinking, but in private correspondence, Lambert admits that he did. So people just aren't that reliable, particularly when they're making public statements.
Could I throw another hat in the ring for just a moment and pull it off the alcoholism, which I agree. But if we go back to his childhood, he had a history of chronic ear infections and high fevers. And when he went to see Moran that night, the whole thing about, he left and took the cane with him. But my belief is that he went to see him. And one of the reasons he went was because he had an earache, which would have been turned into an ear infection in the cold and then produced high fevers, which then would have brought on some delirium and the delusions that were described by these doctors.
Interesting.
You mean he went to see Carter?
Yes, sorry. Yes, Carter. Yeah. And there was some place, my recollection, something about the earache, but the childhood chronic earaches, which, he was, of a tubercular genetic profile. And some of that would have laid him open to have the different problems and the chronic drinking and, being exposed to the cold and then probably being cooped and all the other things. But nobody's talked much about the ear infection. And some of my background is medical speech and hearing pathologist. So I was always fascinated by Poe's ears.
It's true that Poe in various letters goes on in literally painful detail about ear infections and things like that. Although again, one wonders how much of this is purely for dramatic effect. Often it's when he's asking John Allen for money or looking for pity from someone.
They're horribly painful, horribly. And
right, but the problem is we only have Poe making this statement. So the question is Poe really telling what's actually happening? Is he exaggerating something? Is he making it up just for the sake of getting pity? And that we don't really know.
Yeah, he was a tad histrionic, wasn't he?
Well, and in this case, it would be a self-serving, creation. I do think the other point, though, that is a little bit of a counteractive to Alex's question, which is still a good question about whether we're just trying to defend Poe. It's like Ingram tried to defend Poe, but then he raises the question of opium. Often the defenses are worse than the thing that they're trying to defend Poe from. Yep. The coincidences for it being voting day,
yep.
that's what really sustains the cooping theory. We can't prove it, but it is an amazing coincidence. Lots of things really just kind of work in favor of it being considered. It could be suggested in Baltimore in 1860, and it did not seem outrageous to anyone then, because people remembered what the elections were like. So I kind of wonder if it weren't election day, if we didn't have the set of compelling coincidences,
Right.
would we necessarily have quite as much effort to look for an alternative explanation?
Well, to
Right.
say the cooping theory,
Perfect storm for him. You know, you combine the weather, the ear, the weakened from the alcoholism, and probably got the pulp beat out of him during the
Well,
election.
but it doesn't take cooping necessarily. I mean, alcohol would have been flowing freely in the streets on election day. So if we want to say that Poe wasn't cooped, but that he overexposed himself to alcohol again, it was everywhere. It was all around him. So it might be a coincidence that doesn't necessarily end up in cooping.
Yeah.
But
I think
Arrived
Hollis,
in the city
Hollis,
already?
we just can't hear you very well. Can you maybe be a little, yeah, and then John after Hollis, please.
Is that better? Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's much better. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I apologize for joining you late. I've always been fascinated by the election theory that enhances the liquor thing. And even if Poe had imbibed on the way there and entered the city tipsy, and then was corralled by a bunch of roughs from the election into a bar where they were forced to drink, that's like a deadly storm. Those are really horrible situations. And if we really want to open the edge of the envelope a little bit, they could have all conspired against him for the drinking, for the alcohol effects.
I will point out just before we go to John that the testimony of Snodgrass that Poe's clothing apparently was ill-fitted and was not his, therefore, Poe's clothing had been changed. That has been interpreted various ways. If it was cooping, would they actually have bothered to change his clothing? I'm not sure why. It seemed to be an open secret. Nobody seemed to be really caring that Poe wasn't even registered to vote in Baltimore. But the other possibility would be that if he had another psychotic episode like he had had in Philadelphia, he could be trying to hide. He might have changed his clothing, may have shaved his mustache. We don't know if he still had his mustache at the end. Nobody describes the mustache. But he could have had another psychotic episode. He could have been paranoid. He could have been trying to hide from someone. He might have changed the clothing himself. It is possible.
there are other explanations for the clothing besides cooping, yes.
Right. But this is my problem, as I said. We're never going to solve it. It's always fascinating, and we're never going to solve it.
John, go ahead. And then Paul, did you want to say something after John?
I mean, Jeffrey's already addressed what I was going to say. I've always thought that the most convincing evidence for cooping was that he wasn't wearing his own clothes, because he was a pretty fastidious dresser. You know, he was always very well dressed, even if he only had one good suit of clothes. So, but I mean, Jeffrey makes a good point of for reasons he might have changed to some other clothes himself. But
it was raining. It was raining both days. It was raining.
Sorry?
It was raining on the day before the election and the day of the election. And it's possible that he just changed his clothes to get out of wet clothes, and those are the best you could find. That's one possible explanation. Jeffrey's theory or idea about him being paranoid and changing the clothes to disguise himself because of perceived assassins is another explanation. And he could have just soiled his clothes, his original clothing, in a sensitive state. I mean, there are plenty of other explanations for the clothes other than cooping.
Go ahead, Paul.
No, so I would just take this in a slightly different direction and ask a pretty open question. I don't have a real theory about it, which is, how would Poe have thought about his own death? Would he have regarded it as something to be horrified about? Would he have been terrified like one of the characters in his, I don't know, in The Premature Burial or something like that? If he had known he was going to die that day, would he have spent the day in fear? What do you think?
His letters to Mrs. Clem, not that far before it, suggest that he was kind of tired of living. It certainly he might not have been unhappy or terrified. He kind of wanted to join Virginia, and I think he was sort of tired of things. Now, on the other hand, he had cause to think that he might finally be able to get his magazine off the ground if Patterson was going to give him the money. He was clearly under a lot of stress. The idea of marrying Elmira, I think he realized it was very mercenary. The top half of the letter that Susan Tane bought fairly recently, that it only came to surface a couple of years ago, we had the bottom half, we didn't have the top half. The top half shows Poe being extremely calculating about how much money there was going to be, and he was going to claim the money that had been left for Elmira's young son to be tutored, because Poe was going to do the tutoring. It is incredibly mercenary. You can see why Mrs. Clem probably tore that part of the letter off and tried to hide it, and yet it has survived as an autograph. It does not show Poe in a good light at all, but he seems to have recognized that this was kind of a terrible thing, and he was torn. So I think that emotional stress was really intense. He also really wanted to live near Annie Richmond. And apparently, based on this part of the letter too, he had convinced Elmira that she apparently wanted to move away from her family, or at least Poe had convinced her that she wanted to move away from her family, and to move north and not to stay in Richmond, which probably means that Poe would have tried to finagle her to move very close to Lowell, Massachusetts, which would be near Annie. How horrible would that have been for Elmira to essentially, have this sort of emotional mistress hanging around all the time? I mean, it's really kind of an untenable emotional state that Poe was dealing with. I think he was ready to go.
Don't you
He
think
would have loved the fact that, that his death really has cemented part of his fame.
Yeah, don't you think he would just love the fact that we're scratching our heads over what was the cause of his death? I think he would have liked that very much.
Carole, since you have a medical background, I was hoping, I don't really know a whole lot about tuberculosis and how it can stay in one system and come back and forth. And I don't know, I mean, it seems like you're saying you think it's multiple things coming together that caused his death, but I'm just a little more curious about how that would work. I just don't understand it or know much about it.
Well, like when you have chicken pox and you have that as a child, and then when you grow up, you can develop, shingles. That virus has hidden in your system. What?
For multiple decades.
For a long time. Our daughter's having trouble with it after I don't know how many years. So somehow organisms can hide within our own body and remain dormant for a long time.
And Carole, didn't you say that heavy alcohol use in a short period of time can trigger that dormant virus?
Yes, it's called reactivation. Yes.
Yeah, bacteria, yeah.
Yeah, and I got that information from a pulmonologist whose knowledge I respect. And he said that he sees this all the time, that people will have TB, but they don't have any symptoms, and then they start drinking and boom, it starts manifesting itself with symptoms. So it could be pulmonary, but my grandmother had TB in her bones. It can hide in different parts of the body.
Wow.
So
it's very weird, but
pernicious. Yeah.
When it represents, how does it represent? Would they have recognized it? Would they have called it consumption?
Well, consumption just really describes the condition of the body as the disease takes its course.
Right, it's the wasting effect.
It's the wasting effect. And not everyone has pulmonary form. Pulmonary, you'd probably have coughing. Like Virginia, you might have hemorrhaging, but not every form of tuberculosis manufactures itself, and that would make it very hard to recognize.
Whatever it was, apparently he was suffering from it when he was taken to the hospital. He appeared to be at least somewhat recovering, and then it hit him again.
Yeah.
I think that's sort of the most persuasive aspect of what Albert Donay and Renee would like to promote with the carbon, I always mix it up if it's monoxide or
Monoxide.
dioxide poisoning,
Monoxide, yes.
that, the hospital was theoretically lit with this material, and so he would have been re-exposed. That would potentially be a problem. But a heart attack could be exactly the same way. He could have had a heart attack and then a second heart attack in the hospital that finally actually killed him. And the problem is so many of these symptoms can be read in different ways. They don't lead conclusively to one outcome.
That's right. And that's even true today, where doctors are making a lot of observations of your symptoms, but today we also have so much testing that can detect what's wrong, and which they didn't have. And I don't even know that Dr. Moran used a thermometer. They were not common in 1849. Fever was, somebody felt your forehead and said, oh,
right. The idea that he had fever was probably just touching the head and
exactly
warm.
The other issue is how much time did Dr. Moran actually spend with him? I mean, was Poe's identity actually known when he went to the hospital? There's testimony, of course, from Michael Powell that believes that Poe's identity wasn't even known at the hospital until he was discovered dead on the 4th day. I don't believe that, but it is very possible that he was not recognized at first, that he was actually sent to the hospital, not taken on his own, and Moran didn't even know who he was until perhaps Nelson Poe showed up to try to give him linens or something like that, and at that point he recognized who he had in the building there. Right. But if Moran didn't know who he was and he was thrown in the public ward, the drunk tank, and left to linger without any attention whatsoever, there's all kinds of things that could have killed him.
And Moran was obviously going to be very busy with administrative things. And he even says in his claims, though, I think Moncourt is, primarily seems to be seeing Poe. There's the tradition of William Cullen, I think, who at least would have been a low-level intern kind of person. That would be the kind of person I would expect would be doing a daily tending to patients, not the head of the hospital, even such as it was. Right. I just don't think Poe's celebrity was so obvious at the time that Moran seems to have been milking the celebrity much later.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
Yeah. Can I say something?
Oh, sure, Professor.
Okay, I sorry. Who's talking now?
Oh, go ahead, Renee, and then we'll have Bill.
I heard two very interesting things the past minutes. First of all, that Poe had chronic ear problems when he was young. The fact is that the World Health Organization is telling us that carbon monoxide is very dangerous for pregnant women, and Poe's mother was an actress who played on stage that were lit by kerosene lights. So she also probably had some chronic carbon monoxide poisoning. And Poe had hearing problems when he was young, and the World Health Organization is telling us that children from pregnant women who were exposed to carbon monoxide will have hearing problems.
Oh.
That's a link that's established recently. Second thing is that the World Health Organization is warning us that the negative effects of carbon monoxide and alcohol enhance each other. So when you have carbon monoxide, the negative effects of alcohol are enhanced and vice versa. So
exactly.
What I hear now, I still think that carbon monoxide was a very important factor in Poe's life, like in the lives of many people in the 19th century. But in Poe it was very strong because from his early youth, even when he was in the womb of his mother, he was already exposed to carbon monoxide.
Thank you.
And that explains his hearing problems when he was young.
It does sometimes seem that carbon monoxide explains any possible symptom that could be described.
Yeah, well, that's the problem that carbon monoxide, it's a nerve toxin, so the symptoms can be very wide and very varied.
Right, but that means, by definition, symptoms are not necessarily provative of that disorder. It's so broadly defined.
Yes, sure, yeah.
Yeah, okay, Bill, go ahead.
Sure, I just wanted to bring it around to Reynolds. If anybody had anything new or interesting, did he even call out for Reynolds? And does anybody have anything new to share on that?
And since we don't have people who are, some people are newer to Poe studies, do you mind just giving a little more context for Reynolds?
Evidently, upon admission, and y'all any of you can correct me if I'm wrong.
This is based on Moran's account.
Right, that's, but I didn't know if it was a later account or one of the earlier to the.
I think he starts it in the letter to Mrs. Clem.
Yes, it's early. It's early.
Yeah,
And then he repeats it in the others. Although at one point I think he says he was calling out Herring, so it's a little.
Yes, and also he says in a later account that the female members of Reynolds' family came to visit him. You know, it's like completely unreliable.
Right, right.
The most reliable stuff that came from Moran would have been soon after Poe's death, and would have been in that letter to Mariah Clem. That was 5 weeks after the death. And he was, again, we don't know how much time Moran actually spent with Poe. It was probably apprentices or interns or stewards, as they were called. But Moran may have been reading from a case record when he related that Reynolds story
Right.
to Mariah Clem. He may not have actually heard it himself. It may have been in the case record. There was someone that's Jeff points out that thinks that Moran mistakenly identified Reynolds as Herring, but then the question has to be asked: if he was calling out Herring, his cousin or
His uncle.
His uncle, why wouldn't he have yelled Henry instead of Herring? I mean, that question has to be asked.
Well, if someone is in that kind of a state, you could say almost anything, and people kind of make it sound like something. I mean, Reynolds has been suggested as being a ward judge for the voting.
He was an election judge, yeah.
Right. So there are various Reynolds that have been suggested. Someone once suggested, I guess, Jeremiah Reynolds, which makes no sense at all. Poe bringing up someone that he once reviewed a work from, that seems very unlikely. Yeah, I mean, again, it's an interesting piece of information. Actually, if you read Moran's letter, it's an incredibly insensitive letter. It really is an appalling thing to have written to someone to try to console right after the death of basically her only living immediate relative.
I mean, he starts off like he's placating when he starts off, but then he goes into this graphic description of delirium tremens, which would not have been very comforting to her, especially if she's seen it before.
Yeah.
And I don't think Moran changed in his later years. I think it sort of brought out what he was. I have a feeling he had this dramatic impulse always.
Yes, I agree.
So although David is right, the earliest probably is the most accurate. It's a relative value, and we can't tell how much relative value there really is.
Yeah.
So Carol, we're approaching 8 o'clock. Before we had started the official forum, a couple people were kicking around the idea of diabetes as well. I didn't know if you had any thoughts about that you wanted to elaborate on, or you just want to reject it, or.
Is she addressing it to me? Yes.
Yeah, to you, Carol.
Somebody pointed out, I think it was Jeffrey, who said his grandmother had diabetes, and I don't know, that's just very much on the edge as far as I'm concerned, you know.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, go ahead, Renata.
Can I just ask one specific question to Carol once again about TB? When somebody has TB, is it also possible to associate it with brain ischemia and therefore lack of oxygen, and that leading to brain ischemia and consequently to hallucinations and loss of control over reality, or the difference between reality and the imagination?
Yeah, if it affects the lungs, especially to the point where you have what's called hypoxia, where you're not getting sufficient oxygen, that has a definite effect on the brain. It also can travel to the brain. So, you know, a lot of the people that I saw, this was in the 50s when I was working with tuberculosis patients. There were two in particular who were always delirious, and it wasn't really clear. I don't remember that they were taking x-rays of their chest, but it wasn't really clear whether it was actually affecting the brain, the bacillus, directly, or it was affecting them through diminishing the capability of the lungs to supply oxygen to the body. You know, but it certainly can be a side effect. Yeah. I was terrified of TB. Several of my classmates contracted it. We were protected by a European vaccine called the Bacillus calumet-guerin, but apparently it didn't protect everyone. And the bacillus, when it's stained, is red. It looks like rods. And we used to call them red snappers because we thought that they could attack you, which of course they didn't, but it was a kind of fear of contracting tuberculosis because it was a pretty terrible disease.
Carole,
It is a terrible disease. People are still dying of it, by the way.
Yeah. Go ahead,
that
Travis.
story reminds me, Carole, of something I heard about Walker Percy. I was wondering, did you ever hear about his contracting tuberculosis as a medical student? And that sort of shut down his ambitions to become a doctor, and he switched to writing. Did you ever hear that?
No, I didn't know that story.
Yeah, what you said about contracting tuberculosis and exposure of medical professionals, I thought that was kind of an interesting connection.
Yeah, it's pretty terrifying when you see the way it affects people.
Right.
Although in Poe's day, it's interesting how many people trained for the ministry or doctors or lawyers and ended up dabbling in literature. It seems to have been the default occupation for people who did not like what they were doing.
My question has to do with the fact that, first of all, unfortunately, I saw it. One of my grandfathers, unfortunately, died of it many years ago, and we saw it, unfortunately. And so I know a little bit about it. But my question has to do with the fact that perhaps another possible cause, let's say, for Poe's delirium, or the fact that people would say, okay, he was absolutely drunk and he died of delirium tremens. Maybe instead of that, we're just talking about TB. I don't know. That's another bet.
Yeah, well, it's a possibility.
There's another possibility in all this. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah. Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm new to the group, but I feel like I know almost half of you because I think I've talked to about half of you over the past couple of weeks, and I see some smiles and nodding going on here. Another possibility is tuberculosis meningitis, which is, if it goes active very quickly, it can go to the brain, and it can mimic a lot of the conditions which was called brain fever at the time. So you could be carrying around tuberculosis latently, and one of the leading tubercular research units is at Case Western University. And I submitted Poe's case to them, and they said immediately it would be a miracle if he was not carrying around tuberculosis with him. He probably did in some form. And a lot of the other things that everybody's talking about, alcohol being one, can make that go active at different, anything that suppresses the immune system, anything that weakens the immune system can make tuberculosis go active. And if it's tuberculosis meningitis, which can go to the brain very fast, that can, and again, I don't think this can be solved either, folks. You know, I've told many of you over the past few weeks, I believe this is as cold a cold case as you can possibly have, because you need hard evidence in order to prove it. But Carole is put forth a very strong possibility here with tuberculosis, basically because it's a strong suspect, because he probably was carrying it around. And it was almost impossible. As somebody once, somebody at the, I interviewed somebody at the Mutter Museum, because I believe they were on this theory in the about 20 years ago. And I believe that tuberculosis was in his system. And they said flat out, it was. He was living in close quarters with, it's airborne. He could have had it from childhood's hour, if you will pardon the expression. He could have had it introduced into his system at the deathbed of his mother. So, you know, is it a good possibility? I think Carole's really onto something here, is what I'm saying. I think she's
Certainly
introduced an
from
interesting
Virginia.
theory.
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
oh, Virginia,
Hollis.
yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, Mark.
Mhm.
Hollis, what'd you say? I couldn't hear it.
Oh, no, I was just saying in terms of when he might have been exposed to it, early childhood, but certainly being married to Virginia and in close quarters with her, obviously.
Yeah.
Well, we mustn't forget that Mariah Clem was just as close to all of them. I mean, she took in Henry, who died supposedly of tuberculosis. Her daughter died of tuberculosis. There's no question that Poe had it, and Mariah Clem had it. But apparently, I'm not a doctor, but apparently some people have an immunity to it.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
That's right.
I know somebody who at 82 was examined by a doctor. His daughter took him to a doctor. He's one of these people didn't like doctors, hadn't been examined since the war. And he went in and the doctor said, "How long have you had tuberculosis?" And he said, "I don't." And he said, "Oh, yes, you do. I've just listened to your lungs and you've got it." And he didn't know it. He carried around if you're strong enough, you can even have active tuberculosis. And if your system is strong enough, you won't be symptomatic. If you're athletic enough, if you get enough fresh air, you can suppress it and live with it.
It's also true that your lungs are a fairly large organ and they can tolerate a lot of damage before it becomes obvious in many cases.
Exactly.
And Brooke Pierce was being treated for pneumonia for quite a while, and only at the end did they suddenly realize that he actually had lung cancer.
Mm.
So,
I think Richard, were you going to say something? Yeah, go ahead. We can't hear you, Richard. I don't know.
I was making 2 points. One is, if I remember my biography of Thomas Wolfe, when he was a boy, he had a paper route that included a tuberculosis sanitarium. And when he died at only the age of 28, I believe he died of TB. So the argument was that he was exposed as a boy. That was one thought. And perhaps, Carol, you can use that in the argument that you're making. The other thought is more comical. I was just reading a biography of William Faulkner, the 2-volume biography that Carl Rollison wrote, which is excellent. And what I was contrasting is Faulkner's attitude towards his drinking and Poe's. Poe, of course, was very ashamed, embarrassed, miserable, but Faulkner was not. Faulkner sort of thought it was okay. And a friend of his, I think it was in Hollywood, but he drank back home too, said to him, "Well, why don't I take you to a psychiatrist?" And Faulkner said, "Would he give me a drink?" So I think that there's a remarkable difference in attitude, and I'm almost glad that Poe was as ashamed and embarrassed as he was, even if it was really out of his hands, if it was an addiction.
Yeah.
some of that could be societal. I mean, post-prohibition's failure, someone pointed out that prohibition made drinking acceptable in a strange way. Women who tended not to drink publicly would go to speakeasies and they kind of learned to drink. So society's reaction to it, it wasn't seen as quite the same moral failing that it was in Poe's lifetime.
Of course, Faulkner was born in 1897 and prohibition was some years after he began to drink, but possibly.
Were they using snuff also at this time? Anyone know?
You mean for Poe's lifetime?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Because, you know, who knows? That was popular then too.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Carol, if you want, I'd like to let you have the final word. If you want to end by just insisting on a certain way he died, or any other reflections about his death here on his anniversary, please feel free to do so.
Well, I just think that it is a mystery. That's why I called it The Mysterious Death of Edgar Allan Poe, because there are so many possibilities. The sources that we have, the testimonies are unreliable. And that's why I like to compare it to Rashomon, if you know that film at all.
Yes.
People are describing the same event and it's all very, very different.
Yes.
So what's the truth?
Mm.
I don't know if we'll ever know unless we do manage to dig up Poe and find out what's in that grave.
And do you think it would be worth it, Carol, to get a hold of those bones if we could?
Absolutely. I
So,
wouldn't want to destroy the monument. I mean, Jeffrey said it's rather fragile, right? But I wouldn't want to do that.
yeah. So, all right. Well, thank you so much, Carol, for this presentation. Thank you. Yeah, for those of us on camera, we'll applaud.
Thanks very much. I thought it
Yeah.
was fun to have the discussion.
Yeah, and on his anniversary of his death especially. So, so everybody, thank you for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you on Tuesday, November 10th at 7 when Enrique Jang takes us through a virtual tour of the Poe House. Everyone have a great night or a very early morning if you're Jacqueline. And all right, take care.
Bye. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care, everyone.
Stay healthy.